Hello there. There's a bit of bad history that gets on my nerves, and I'd like to talk about that today. That being the idea that when considering historical technology, that surviving examples are the only thing that matters. The idea that without surviving examples, there's no way to prove whether said piece of technology existed definitively, and as such it should be left out of all historical speculation. Now, while it's true that surviving examples are the only source of definitive proof, as written sources can be false and artistic sources can be exaggerated, this is nonetheless a simplistic, narrow-minded, and not particularly useful perspective. The reason being that it's a minor miracle that anything survives for more than 100 years at all. When studying history, we can't afford to be too picky about our evidence. A healthy dose of skepticism is fine, but there's a difference between skepticism and denialism. To illustrate this point, I'm going to do a little experiment. One of the most common arguments put forward in the leather armor debate is that we don't have very many surviving examples, and therefore it must not have been very common. Let's apply this argument to something else that's made of leather: moccasins. First, we're going to calculate how many moccasins existed in the eastern Great Lakes throughout all of history. To begin with, we'll take the reported population for the nations surrounding Lake Ontario. All in all, this amounts to about 300,000 people. Now we'll see how many moccasins each person would need in their lifetime. Moccasin soles only last a year or two, but the uppers might last you 10 years. Now, assuming you made it out of childhood and you weren't a professional soldier, you could probably expect to live to close to 70 years. So every person would need at least 7 pairs of moccasins in their lifetime. Probably more, but let's stick to the bottom end of the estimate. So that makes 2,100,000 moccasins for a generation. Now, the most conservative estimates for how long people have been in the Great Lakes region is a little over 4,000 years. It's probably a heck of a lot more than that, but let's stick to the bottom end of the estimate. So that's around 40 centuries, and let's round things to 2 generations per century. So that's about 80 generations of people being in the area. Now we multiply that by how many moccasins per generation, and we get a grand total of 168 million moccasins that existed around Lake Ontario throughout history, at a fairly conservative estimate. Now, the Royal Ontario Museum is the most prestigious museum in Canada, one of the most prestigious in North America. Let's see how many pairs of pre-Columbian moccasins exist in their online catalog. Here's one from 1880, that's pretty old. Another one from 1880. Lots of ones from the 1900s, I'm noting. Oh, 1870, that's really old. 150 years. Well, what else we got? 1870, another one. Another 1880. Another 1880 there. 1874 up there. Nothing earlier than the 1870s. Interesting. Oh, here we go. 1770. A single moccasin. Maker Huron question mark? So what is that, 250 years old? Okay, we've got a single moccasin that's 250 years old. Do we have anything else? Anything older than 250 years? I scrolled through the entire collection. There was nothing older than 1770. Out of 168 million pre-Columbian moccasins, not a single one is housed in the most prestigious museum in Canada. I then expanded the search into every single potential article of clothing, went through the entire catalog. The only thing I found that went even close was this Innu coat from 1770. So, extrapolating from this in the bad history fashion, we can surmise that First Nations peoples had no knowledge of clothing until 1770, where it was no doubt developed in response to the adverse conditions in the war with the Yanks. This is a plainly nonsensical position. As anyone can tell you, Canada gets cold. I want to talk about why leather doesn't survive. Firstly, because you can cut it into strips to sew with, even small pieces of leather are useful to recycle. Secondly, pieces that aren't useful can be boiled down into glue. Right? There's a reason they call it hide glue. The next reason being that leather is one of the more temperamental materials in terms of long-term preservation. It requires very specific conditions to survive. Obviously, it needs to be prevented from rotting, but it also needs to be prevented from drying. Here's a leather lace that you might use for sewing. I can't tear it with just my hands. Here's a piece of goat skin that was sitting in a basement for 40 years. As you can see, I can rip it apart as though it were a piece of paper. Here's a freshly tanned deerskin. I can't do anything to it. Two grown men working together couldn't tear this. Even if I were to stand on one corner and then try and stretch it using the full muscles of my legs, I wouldn't be able to tear it. Here's an old goat skin. I can tear it apart just like paper. Notice the clouds of dust that get released as I tear this. What's happened here is that as the oils in the leather dry out, the fibers of the leather will contract away from each other so that they're no longer interlocking. If you leave it long enough, the leather will literally turn to dust. This is what's happening when you see old cracked leather on a belt or your boots or a couch. The oils are evaporating and the leather is contracting away from itself. So leather needs to be guarded both from rot as well as from drying out if it's to survive more than 100 years. This is why it's hardly ever found outside of bogs. So in summary, if you're going to use absence of artifacts as part of some claim, you need to understand why those artifacts might not have survived. I hope you found this interesting. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.